Angular Pro tip, and in this tip we're going to talk about structural directives. We are going to present a use case where you should probably consider using structural directives. And the use case that I'm talking about is that if you have a repeating ngIf condition, it's a probably good sign that you can avoid that dry violation, that don't repeat yourself violation. And it's a sign that you should do that by probably creating a structural directive. So a use case that I'm talking about is if you have a repeating ngIf condition, it's probably a sign that you should use structural directives. And I feel somehow that structural directives tend to be underused in Angular. They are so powerful, the directive and structural directive. Their use case, once you get used to the syntax and you understand proper way to use them, you use them often. It's going to be very used feature in Angular. And if you compare Angular to other library or frameworks like React, for example, the same thing that you used in directive and structural directive is really hard to do in other frameworks. And so the directive is a real powerful tool. And when I go and teach other Angular developers, I feel they have strong understanding regarding components, services, modules. These are the tools that they tend to use in Angular. But most of them are not actually using enough directive or understand where to use directive. I feel a lot of Angular developers are missing on this powerful feature. So I want to give an example of a good use case where you should use structural directive. And structural directive, probably the most popular directive that any Angular developer is aware of and is using often, is the ngIf. So structural directives usually comes with an asterisk sign and then a name of the attribute, for example ngIf, and it's usually a sign that it can manipulate the DOM. It can do some sort of template change. So ngIf is getting some sort of template, and it might present that template or discard that template depending on some sort of condition. So structural directives are doing the same. They're getting some kind of template as an input, and then can decide to manipulate the DOM based on the input, that template input that they are getting. So usually we use it with a selector of asterisk and then attribute name, and the directive gets a template which you can reference by template ref, and then it usually manipulates the DOM based on that input of a template. So an example of a directive is, you see in this code, this directive has a selector of attribute name, and then it can reference the template or the view container that is assigned to that directive. That is the place where it usually does its DOM manipulation, and it's also getting the template where it can manipulate the DOM based on the template. So I want to give an example of a good use case where you should consider using the structural directive. So let's start a new Angular application. I'll go to my terminal. I'm going to type Angular npx Angular CLI latest, and we're going to create a new project. We're going to name that project structural directive demo, and I'm going to add the minimal flag to create minimal amount of files, no external templates, no external style, so we can actually focus on the structural directives code. The styling is not that important in this project. We'll just choose CSS. Since we're using Angular 17, and since Angular 17, you are being asked by Angular CLI if you want to add server-side rendering, Angular Universal, and static site generation. So we're not going to focus on this, so we'll just choose no. And we'll let Angular CLI create our Angular project, and we will open that project with VS Code. Now that we created our Angular application, let's show an example of a repeating ngIf condition. This is a simplification of something that I noticed in a real world big Angular project. And I saw a repeating ngIf condition, and once we used structural directive, it really simplified a lot of things. So in our case, we are going to have a service that will supply the logged in user. So we're going to generate this service, and we'll call it the user service. And we're going to skip the tests. Oh, sorry, I misspelled it. We're going to skip the tests and create this user service. Now the user service is our way to get the logged in user. And to simplify things, let's say that this user service is going to provide the logged in user using a behavior subject. The behavior subject will supply the user, or will supply null. So let's create our user. Our user will look like this. Our user will be type which has a first name, which is a string, and a last name, which is also a string. So this is the type of our user, and our user service has going to supply us with our user using a behavior subject, and it will either supply us with a user or it will supply us with null if the user is not logged in. So let's import our user state, and let's say our user, let's initiate the behavior subject with a logged in user. Let's say we have a first name of hello and a last name of world. So we have a service that is supplying our user. You might get that user, this is a simplification, so in a real-world Angular application, you might get this user from a server or from ngRx or whatever place that you get the user. In our case, we'll simply supply it with a behavior subject. Now I can access this user in my component. So in my app component, I can create a constructor. Let's delete this title. I can create a constructor, and in my constructor I can request for a request for my user service from the dependency injector, and I can say I have a user which is initiated with the user service dot-user. And now I can go and print that user, but since it's a behavior subject, I need to print the user with the async pipe. So I'm going to access the user $. I'm going to print it with the async pipe, and we can pipe it to JSON, to another pipe, just to see the object itself. Now I can serve my app, so I can ng serve and see the result of this in my browser. So our browser is now displaying the logged in user. Let's show what we mean by repeating ngIf conditions. Let's say you have, instead of welcome to user, you have this in an ngIf. So only if ngIf you have the user is defined, is not null, only then will you print the user. Now, what it means that if my user, right now, if my user is defined, I will print it. If my user is not defined, let's say we grab the user and we pass in the behavior subject, we pass null, then right now nothing is displayed. But we can make that ngIf a bit better, right? So if I go back to my component, instead of grabbing the user again here, I can say, okay, let's get the implicit and place it in a variable user, and now I don't have to pipe it to the async. I'm just moving the user to the implicit, to a variable user that is available in the context of this directive. So in this context, I can use the user as a value. I don't even need the async pipe here, so I can print user.firstname, right? So in this case, we have, let's restore our user back and see that hello is printed, right? So you can take the value that you are checking, the Boolean casting of that value, you can place it in a variable. You can also place else, let's say guest, and then provide with an ng template that is the else case. So I will place a name of guest, like the name here that I provided, and if so, I'm going to place h1 hello guest. So let's see the result now. Welcome hello, but if my user service is set to null again, and I go back to the browser, I have hello guest. So this is different variations of the ngIf. But let's keep it simple. Let's say I got not the else case. And let's delete this ng template. So if I have a logged in user, I want to print that user. And let's say this ngIf is something that is repeating often in my Angular application. So I have a lot of cases where I need to grab the user, the logged in user, check if the user is indeed logged in. If I can get an actual user, I might get an anonymous user, I might get a null. So I often, in many components, I use this condition. I'm checking my logged in user. So if you have many components with the same condition, it's a good sign that you need to use a structural directive. And let's see how we can avoid that repeating ngIf of checking if I get the user and replace this logic with really simple, really avoiding those dry violation structural directive. So let's create our structural directive that will be a much easier API than that ngIf checking the user and also grabbing the user service and grabbing the user from the user service and using the async pipe. So let's create a much simpler API to grab the logged in user. And to create my, and let's even do it, let's add a change detection on strategy on push. As usual, we recommend all your components be in the on-push change detection strategy. So let's create a directive using Angular CLI. So I'll ng generate a directive. I'm going to name this directive with user, and I'm going to skip creating the tests. Now our directive is created. My directive, let's open this directive. I want the API of this directive to be as follows. So in our case, the app component is using h1 and ngIf. So instead of this API, I want this kind of API. So instead of this, I want this API. So I want instead of ngIf to the attribute of the directive to be with user. This is the attribute name. So let's replace the selector to have a with user. Great. Now I want also to allow passing this directive will print this h1 only if I have a logged in user. So I can use also this directive to easily access the logged in user. So I want to also allow grabbing the user by providing a variable, for example, user or whatever you want to call this variable, and this will be assigned with the logged in user. So we call it implicit. I implicitly allowed to pass a template variable, whatever name you want, and I will pass it some value. It's called implicit, and now I can access this user in this h1, so I can say user.firstname without the need for a sync pipe. So let's implement this API for our directive. So if I want to grab the h1, this template that will be included if I have a logged in user or if I don't have a logged in user. If I want to grab this h1, I can grab it from the dependency injector. It's called template ref. Now the template ref will get a generic type. The generic type represents the context of the template. What variables are available in this template? In this case, we have the user variable. So we can say our template ref has an implicit. Remember, if you supply without a name, then it's called implicit. So the template context include implicit, which is of type user. Also, a directive is getting assigned with a view container where you can draw, we can change the DOM. So this is called view container ref. And I can ask for this as well, because my directive will change, the view container will print this h1 if I have a logged in user. Obviously I need the logged in user, so I'm also going to need the user service. Now my directive is going to do all its work in the onInit lifecycle hook. So in here I'm going to implement the onInit. I'm going to add ng onInit. I'm going to subscribe to my user service, to the user. I'm going to subscribe to the logged in user. This means that in my subscribe function, I'm going to get the logged in user. So this user, I remind you, it will be either user or null. Now, if I have a logged in user, this means if user will be entered, then I can grab the view container ref, and then I can call create embedded view and pass the template that I'm getting, meaning the h1 in this example above. I'm printing the h1, and also I can supply the context. So I can say implicit will be the user. So this is basically the logic of my structural directive. I'm only going to draw the template if I have a user. Now if I have the user, I'm going to draw the template and also pass it to the template. Now let's see that our structural directive is working. Let's go back to the app component, and now instead of this ngIf, I can use my structural directive. So I can do with user, and I can pass to a variable let's call it let logged in user, and logged in user, I'm going to print the first name of this logged in user. So let's go back to our browser. Let's verify that we have a logged in user. So we have a logged in user. The reason why this is not recognized is because those are standalone directives and components. If you have a module, you'll usually place the directive that we just created in the declaration of that module. In Angular 17, the default is standalone components, so we'll have to add our directive to the imports array. So let's add a with user directive, and let's check out, well, our code is working. We have a welcome hello. So this means that in my component now I don't need a user service, I don't need the constructor, so I have a lot of code that I can now delete. I don't need the user service. All I need to access the user is this groovy directive with structural directive that will allow me to print a template and access the user with that template. So everything is working. I can also print the logged in user last name as well. So now we have welcome, hello, hello world. So we saw here that repeating ngIf condition is actually a good signal that you can avoid that dry violation using structural directive. So in this pro tip, we saw an example of using structural directive. We saw that sometimes when you have ngIf with the repeating condition, consider maybe using structural directive. Consider if you have ngIf that is passing information with the implicit, like we provided with the user, or supplying some kind of information to your template and displaying that template or not with that information, it's also a sign for using structural directives. Do you ever notice a signal, something that signals you to use structural directive, a repeating pattern that causes you to use structural directives? Write down in the comments, when did you use your structural directives? When is a good sign for you to use a structural directive? Structural directives and directives in general are really powerful, and it's really important to master them, and you'll see a lot of doors are opening with an easier API. Not everything needs to be a component, and a lot of stuff are actually easier to achieve with a structural directive. As usual, we have all our source code in our site, academies.com, EN course Angular best practices, structural directives. In the site, you have a step-by-step guide along with a source code. You have code sandpack with all the files, and you can change and modify those files. And check out the site if you want to create, follow along and write the code yourself. Also, don't forget to like us and subscribe if you like the comment. And that's it. Thank you.